The Ignorant Schoolmaster, 5 Lessons in Intellectual Emancipation. The Society of Contempt. Page 75. But there is no such thing as a possible society. There is only the society that exists. We were getting lost in our dreams, but here comes someone knocking at the door. It's the envoy from the Minister of Public Instruction, who has come to call to Monsieur Jacoto's attention the royal decree setting out the conditions for establishing a school in the kingdom. It's the officer from the military school of Delft assigned to bring order to the strange École Normale Militaire in Louvain. It's the messenger bringing the last issue of Annales Academiae Louvainiensis, containing the oratio of our colleague Franciscus Josephus Dumek, who sounds the charge against universal teaching, the new corrupter of youth, since education embraces the totality of the people and its first virtue resides in unitary harmony. A perverse method can destroy that unity and split the city into opposing camps. Let us rid the country of this madness. Guided by the love of beauty and of literature, studious young people must not only attempt to flee laziness as the most serious of evils, they must also cling to that decency, that modesty, celebrated by all antiquity with divine honors. Only then will they be citizens of the elite, defenders of law, masters of virtue, interpreters of the divine commandments, upholders of the country, of the honor of an entire race. And you too, Royal Majesty, must listen. For it is to you that the care of your subjects has been confided, especially at that tender age. It is a sacred duty to annihilate teachers of this kind, to suppress schools of darkness. 1 page 76. The Kingdom of the Netherlands is a small state, but it is civilized just like a big one. Public authority holds the education of young people and the harmony of citizens among its most privileged concerns. Opening a school is not granted to just anyone, not to someone without a certificate, but especially not to someone who boasts of teaching what he doesn't know, and of exciting people against the schoolmasters, assistant schoolmasters, rectors, inspectors, commissioners, and ministers who hold to a higher idea of their duties to youth and to science. Absit hic nostra patria furor. Or, in our own words, stultification, rearing its ugly head, cries out to me, "Go back, you mad innovator. The species you want to take away from me is attached to me by indissoluble chains. I am what was, what is, and what shall be on earth, as long as souls inhabit bodies of clay. Today, less than ever, can you hope for success. They believe in progress, and their opinions are solidly hinged on this. I laugh at your efforts, they will not budge. 2. The law of gravity. We were getting lost watching thinking minds orbiting around the truth. But matter's movements obey other laws, those of attraction and gravity. All bodies mindlessly hurl themselves toward the center. We have said that nothing can be induced about minds from leaves, about the immaterial from the material. Intelligence does not follow the laws of matter. But this much is true for each individual's intelligence taken separately: it is indivisible, without community, without division. It cannot, therefore, belong to any group, for then it would no longer belong to the individual. We must therefore conclude that intelligence is only in individuals, that it is not in their union. Intelligence is in each intellectual unity. The union of these unities is necessarily inert and without intelligence. In the cooperation of two intellectual molecules called men, there are two minds. They are of the same nature, but it isn't one unique intelligence that presides over this cooperation. Page 77. In matter, a unique force, gravity, animates mass and molecules, but in the class of intellectual beings, intelligence directs individuals alone. Their union is subject to the laws of matter. 3. We have seen reasonable individuals crossing over the bounds of linguistic materiality in order to signify their thought to one another. But this interchange is possible only on the basis of the inverted relation that submits the union of intelligences to the laws of any grouping, those of matter. Here we have the material hinge of stultification. Immaterial minds cannot be linked together except by making them submit to the laws of matter. The free orbit of each intelligence around the absent star of the truth, the distant flight of free communication on the wings of the word, is found to be thwarted, driven off course by universal gravitation toward the center of the material universe. Everything happens as though the intelligence lived in a double world. And maybe we should give some credit to the Manichean hypothesis. Manicheanism saw disorder in creation, and explained it by the meeting of two kinds of intelligence. It's not simply that there is a principle of good and a principle of evil. More profoundly, it's that two intelligent principles don't make one intelligent creation. At the moment when the Viscount de Bonald proclaimed the restoration of divine intelligence, manager of language and of human society, some men of progress were tempted to revive, in opposition, the hypotheses of the heretics and the Manicheans. They compared the powers of intelligence at work in scholars and inventors with the sophistries and disorders of deliberative assemblies, and willingly saw in this the action of two antagonistic principles. This is how it was for Jeremy Bentham and his disciple James Mill, witnesses of the madness of English conservative assemblies, as well as for Joseph Jacotot, witness of the madness of French revolutionary assemblies. But let's not blame the absent divinity too quickly, and let's not let the actors in these madnesses completely off the hook. Perhaps we should simplify the hypothesis: divinity is one, it is man who is double. Page 78. Divinity gave man a will and an intelligence with which to respond to the needs of his existence. These were given to individuals, not to the species. The species doesn't need one or the other. It doesn't need to watch over its preservation. It is individuals who preserve the species. It is they alone who need a reasonable will to guide freely the intelligence placed at their service. On the other hand, we cannot expect reason from the social group. It is because it is, and that's that. And it can only be arbitrary. A case has been made, we know, for its foundation in nature, the case for the inequality of intelligence. In this case, we saw, the social order would be natural. Human laws, the laws of convention, would be useless for preserving it. Obedience to these laws would no longer be a duty or a virtue, it would derive from the intellectual superiority of the Cadis and the Janissaries, and such groups would rule on the same grounds as man rules over animals. For we can see clearly that it is not like this. Therefore convention alone can reign in the social order. But is convention necessarily unreasonable? We have seen that the arbitrariness of language proved nothing against the rationality of communication. We could thus imagine another hypothesis, one where each of the individual wills that make up the human species would be reasonable. In this case, everything would happen as though the human species were itself reasonable. The wills would become harmonious, and human groups would follow a straight line, without jostling, without deviation, without error. But how can we reconcile such uniformity with the liberty of individual wills, each of which can use or not use reason whenever it pleases? The moment of reason for one corpuscle is not the same as for its neighboring atoms. In any given moment there is always reason, distraction, passion, calm, attention, wakefulness, sleep, relaxation, progress in all directions. Therefore, in a given moment, a corporation, a nation, a species, a type, is at once reasonable and irrational, and the result does not depend at all on the will of the group. Therefore, it is precisely because each man is free that a union of men is not. 5 Page 79. The founder emphasized his therefores. This is not an incontestable truth he is developing for us, it's a supposition, an adventure of his mind that he recounts starting from the facts he has observed. We have already seen that the mind, the alliance between will and intelligence, knows two fundamental modalities, attention and distraction. There need only be distraction for intelligence to give way, for it to be overcome by the gravitation of matter. Thus certain philosophers and theologians explain original sin as a simple distraction. In this sense we can say with them that evil is only an absence. But we also know that this absence is also a refusal. The distracted person doesn't see why he should pay attention. Distraction is laziness first, the desire to retire from effort. But laziness itself isn't the torpor of the flesh, it is the act of the mind underestimating its own power. Reasonable communication is based on the equality between self-esteem and the esteem of others. It works toward the continuous verification of that equality. Contempt is the principle behind the laziness that causes intelligence to plummet into material gravity. This contempt tries to pass itself off as modesty. I can't, says the ignorant one who wants to withdraw from the task of learning. We know through experience what that modesty means. Self-contempt is always contempt for others. I can't, says the student who doesn't want to submit his improvisation to his peers' judgment. I don't understand your method, someone says. I'm incompetent, I don't understand anything about it. You quickly understand what he means. This isn't common sense, since I don't understand it, a man like me. 6 So it goes at any age and at all levels of society. These beings who pretend to be slighted by nature only want pretexts to dispense with some study they don't like, some exercise that is distasteful to them. Do you want to be convinced? Wait a minute, let them speak, hear them out. After the rhetorical precaution issued by this modest character, who lacks, he says, a poetic mind, do you hear what solidity of judgment he attributes to himself? What perspicacity distinguishes him? Nothing escapes him. If you let him continue, the metamorphosis is at last complete, and now the modesty is transformed into pride. Page 80. We can find examples of this in every village as in every city. Another's superiority in some realm is recognized so that one's own superiority in some other realm will be recognized, and it isn't difficult to see, at the end of the speech, that our superiority always ends up being, in our eyes, the superior superiority. 7 Inequalities passion. We can thus assign a unique passion as the cause of the distraction by which intelligence consents to matter's destiny. Contempt, inequalities passion. It isn't love of wealth or possessions that perverts the will, it's the need to think under the sign of inequality. Hobbes composed a more attentive poem on this subject than Rousseau. Social evil does not come from the first person who bethought himself to say, "This is mine." It comes from the first person who bethought himself to say, "You are not my equal." Inequality is not the consequence of anything, it is a primitive passion. Or, more exactly, it has no other cause than equality. Inegalitarian passion is equality's vertigo, laziness in face of the infinite task equality demands, fear in face of what a reasonable being owes to himself. It is easier to compare oneself, to establish social exchange as that swap meet of glory and contempt where each person receives a superiority in exchange for the inferiority he confesses to. Thus the equality of reasonable beings vacillates within social inequality. To remain within the metaphor of our cosmology, we will say that it is the passion of preponderance that has subjected free will to the material system of weightiness, that has caused the mind to plummet into the blind world of gravitation. It is inegalitarian irrationality that makes the individual renounce himself, renounce the incommensurable immateriality of his essence, and that engenders aggregation as a fact and as the reigning collective fiction. The love of domination requires people to protect themselves from each other in the heart of a conventional order that cannot be reasonable, since it is made up of nothing but the irrationality of each, that submission to another's laws that the desire to be superior to him fatally entails. Page 81. The creation of our imagination that we call humankind is made up of our individual madnesses without partaking of our individual wisdom. 8 So let's not blame blind necessity or the ill fate of being a soul enclosed in a body of clay and subjected to the evil divinity of matter. There is no evil divinity, no fatal mass, no radical evil. There is only this passion or fiction of inequality that brings its own consequences. That is why social submission can be described in two apparently contradictory manners. We could say that the social order is subject to an irrevocable material necessity, that it moves, like the planets, by eternal laws that no individual can change. But we could just as easily say that it is only a fiction. Type, species, corporation, nothing of the sort has any reality. Only individual humans are real. They alone have a will and an intelligence, and the totality of the order that subjects them to humankind, to social laws and to diverse authorities, is only a creation of the imagination. These two ways of speaking amount to the same thing. It's the irrationality of each person that endlessly creates and recreates this overwhelming mass, this absurd fiction, to which each citizen must subject his will, but from which each man also has the means of withdrawing his intelligence. What we do, what we say in court, as in the tribunal, as in war, is regulated by suppositions. Everything is a fiction, only the consciousness and reason that each of us has is invariable. The social state, moreover, is founded on these principles. If man obeyed reason, then laws, magistrates, and all that would be unneeded, but passions carry him along, he revolts, he is punished in quite a humiliating manner. Each of us finds himself forced to look for the support of another against someone else. It is obvious that from the moment men form society for the purpose of protecting themselves against each other, this reciprocal need announces an alienation of reason that promises no reasonable result. What better can society do than to chain us to that unhappy condition to which we ourselves are devoted? 9 page 82. Thus the social world is not simply the world of non-reason, it is that of irrationality, which is to say, of an activity of the perverted will, possessed by inequality's passion. In linking one person or group to another by comparison, individuals continually reproduce this irrationality, this stultification that institutions codify and explicate or solidify in their brains. This production of irrationality is a work at which individuals employ as much art, as much intelligence, as they would for the reasonable communication of their minds' works. Except that this work is a work of grief. War is the law of the social order. But by the term war, let us not think here of any fatal clash of material forces, any unleashing of hordes dominated by bestial instincts. War, like all human works, is first an act of words. But these words reject the halo of ideas radiating from a counter-translator representing another intelligence and another discourse. The will no longer attempts to figure out and to be figured out. It makes its goal the other's silence, the absence of reply, the plummeting of minds into the material aggregation of consent. The perverted will doesn't stop using intelligence, but its use is based on a fundamental distraction. It habituates intelligence into only seeing what contributes to preponderance, what serves to cancel out the other's intelligence. The universe of social irrationality is made up of wills served by intelligences. But each of these wills charges itself with destroying another will by preventing another intelligence from seeing. And we know that this result isn't difficult to obtain. One need only play the radical exteriority of the linguistic order against the exteriority of reason. The reasonable will, guided by its distant link with the truth and by its desire to speak with those like it, controls that exteriority, regains it through the force of attention. The distracted will, deterred from the road of equality, uses it in the opposite way, in the rhetorical mode, to hasten the aggregation of minds, their plummet into the universe of material attraction. Page 83. Rhetorical madness. This is the power of rhetoric, the art of reasoning that tries to annihilate reason under the guise of reason. Once the English and French revolutions put the power of deliberative assemblies back at the center of political life, curious minds revived Plato's and Aristotle's grand inquiry into the power of the false that imitates the power of the truth. That is why, in 1816, the G.E. Etienne Dumont translated his friend Jeremy Bentham's treatise on parliamentary sophistries into French. Jacques Otto doesn't mention this work. But we can feel its influence in the parts of the Langue Modernelle devoted to rhetoric. Like Bentham, Jacques Otto puts the irrationality of deliberative assemblies at the center of his analysis. The vocabulary he uses to talk about them is close to Dumont's. And his analysis of false modesty recalls Bentham's chapter on the argument ad verecundiam. 10. But if both exposed the machinery of the same comedy, they differed radically in their outlook and in the moral they drew from it. Bentham's polemic was against the English conservative assemblies. He demonstrated the ravages of the well-cloaked authoritarian arguments that the beneficiaries of the existing order employed to oppose any progressive reform. He denounced the allegories that hypostasize the existing order, the words that throw a veil, pleasant or sinister as needed, over things, the sophistries that serve to associate any proposition for reform with the specter of anarchy. For him these sophistries are explained by the play of interest, their success by the intellectual weakness of the voting public and the state of servitude under which it is kept by authority. This is to say that disinterested and free-thinking, rational men can combat them successfully. And Dumont, less impetuous than his friend, insisted on the reasonable hope that assimilates the progress of moral institutions to that of the physical sciences. Aren't there in morals as in physics, errors that philosophy has caused to disappear? It is possible to discredit false arguments to the point that they no longer dare show themselves. Page 84. Do I need any other proof for this than the doctrine, famous for so long, even in England, of the divine right of kings and of the passive obedience of the people? 11. So the principles of disinterested reason can be set against the sophistries of private interest in the theater of politics itself. This supposes the culture of a reason that pits a precision of terms against the metaphors, analogies, and allegories that have invaded the political field, creating the field with words, forging it from absurd reasonings with the help of these words, and thereby casting a veil of prejudice over the truth. Thus, the figurative expression of a body politic has produced a great number of false and extravagant ideas. An analogy, founded solely on this metaphor, has furnished a foundation for pretended arguments, and poetry has invaded the dominion of Ariasun. 12. Against this figurative language, this religious or poetic language that allows irrational interest to drape itself in all kinds of disguises, it is possible to oppose a true language in which words exactly overlap ideas. Jack Otto took exception to such optimism. There is no land gauge of reason. There is only a control of reason over the intention to speak. Poetic language that knows itself as such doesn't contradict reason. On the contrary, it reminds each speaking subject not to take the narrative of his mind's adventures for the voice of truth. Every speaking subject is the poet of himself and of things. Perversion is produced when the poem is given as something other than a poem, when it wants to be imposed as truth, when it wants to force action. Rhetoric is pervert poetry. This means that it too falls in the class of fiction. Metaphor is bound up with the original resignation of reason. The body politic is a fiction, but a fiction is not a figurative expression to which an exact definition of the social group could be opposed. There is really a logic of bodies from which no one, as a political subject, can withdraw. Man can be reasonable, the citizen cannot. There is no reasonable rhetoric, no reasonable political discourse. Page 85. Rhetoric, it is said, has war as its principle. One doesn't seek comprehension in it, only the annihilation of the adverse will. Rhetoric is speech in revolt against the poetic condition of the speaking being. It speaks in order to silence. You will speak no longer, you will think no longer, you will do this, that is its program. Its efficacy is regulated by its own suspension. Reason commands us to speak always, rhetorical irrationality speaks only to bring about the moment of silence, the moment of the act, we say willingly, in homage to the person who makes action out of words. But this moment is instead much more one of the lack of an act, of absent intelligence, of subjugated will, of men subjected to the unique law of gravity. The orator's successes are the work of the moment, he does away with the decree the way someone storms a fortification. The length of the pauses, the literary order, elegance, all the qualities of style, are not what lends merit to this kind of discourse. It is a sentence, a word, sometimes an accent, a gesture, that awakened the sleeping people and elevated the mass that tends always to fall back down under its own weight. As long as Manilius could point to the capital, the gesture saved him. As soon as Phocion could seize the moment to speak a sentence, Demos thence was conquered. Mirabeau understood this, he directed movements, compelled an easing up, through sentences and words, queried on 3 points, he replied, he even discussed them at length in an effort to change, little by little, people's minds, then he suddenly departed from parliamentary habits and closed the discussion in one word. However long the orator's discourse, it is never the length, it is never the exposition, that grants victory. The least skilled antagonist will meet well-rounded sentences with well-rounded sentences, exposition with exposition. The orator is whoever triumphs, it is whoever pronounced the word, the sentence that tipped the balance. Point 13. We see that this superiority judges itself, it is the superiority of gravity. The superior man who tips the balance will always be he who best foresees when and how it will tip. He who bends others best is he who bends best himself. By submitting to his own irrationality, he causes the masses' irrationality to triumph. Whoever wants to be the people's master is forced to be their slave. Page 86. So Socrates had taught Alcibiades, as he had Callicles before him. Alcibiades might be amused by the foolish face of a shoemaker glimpsed in his workshop and expound on the stupidity of those people. The philosopher would be content to reply to him, "Why aren't you more at ease when you have to speak in front of those people?" 14. The superior inferiors. That was the case long ago. The superior mind, habituated to the serious speech of voters' assemblies, will say. This was true of the demagogic assemblies drawn from the scum of the people who turned to and fro like a weather vane from Demos thence to Escines, and from Escines back to Demos thence. Let's look at this more closely. The stupidity that made the Athenian people turn sometimes to Escines, sometimes to Demosthenes, had a very precise content. What made them surrender alternatively to the one or the other was not their ignorance or their versatility. It was that this speaker or that one, at a particular moment, knew best how to incarnate the specific stupidity of the Athenian people, the feeling of its obvious superiority over the imbecile people of Thebes. In short, what moved the masses was the same thing that animates superior minds, the same thing that makes society turn on itself from one age to the next, the sentiment of the inequality of intelligence, the sentiment that distinguishes superior minds only at the price of confusing them with universal belief. Even today, what is it that allows the thinker to scorn the worker's intelligence if not the worker's contempt for the peasant, like the peasant's for his wife, the wife's for his neighbor's wife, and so on unto infinity? Social irrationality finds its formula in what could be called the paradox of the superior inferiors. Each person is subservient to the one he represents to himself as inferior, subservient to the law of the masses by his very pretension to distinguish himself from them. Page 87. Don't try to find an alternative to these demagogic assemblies in the reasonable serenity of assemblies made up of grave and respectable notables. Wherever people join together on the basis of their superiority over others, they give themselves over to the law of material masses. An oligarchical assembly, a congress of honest people or of capable ones, will thus obey the brute law of matter much more certainly than a democratic assembly. A senate has a determined pace and direction that it cannot itself change, and the orator that propels it down its own road and follows in its steps, always wins out over the others. 15. AP Pius Claudius, absolutely opposed to taking any instructions from the plebeians, was the senatorial orator par excellence, because he understood better than any other the inflexibility of the movement that pushed the leaders of the Roman elite in their direction. His rhetorical machine, the machine of superior men, seized a unique day, the day when the plebeians gathered on the Aventine. It would have taken a madman, that is to say, a reasonable man, to save things on that day, someone capable of an extravagance impossible and incomprehensible for an Appius Claudius, going to listen to the plebeians, presuming that their mouths emitted a language and not just noises, speaking to them, supposing they had the intelligence to understand the words of superior minds, in short, considering them equally reasonable beings. The parable of the Aventine recalls the paradox of the inegalitarian fiction. Social inequality is unthinkable, impossible, except on the basis of the primary equality of intelligence. Inequality cannot think itself. Even Socrates advised Callicles in vain that to break out of the master-slave circle he must learn that true equality is proportion, thus joining the circle of those who think of justice in terms of geometry. Wherever there is caste, the superior gives up his reason to the inferior's law. An assembly of philosophers is an inert body that moves on the axis of its own irrationality, the irrationality of everyone. In egalitarian society tries in vain to understand itself, to give itself a natural foundation. It's precisely because there is no natural raison for domination that convention commands and commands absolutely. Page 88. Those who explain domination by superiority fall into the old aporia, the superior ceases being that when he ceases dominating. The Duke of Levis, academician and peer of France, worried about the social consequences of the Jacoto system. If one proclaimed the equality of intelligence, why would wives still obey their husbands, and the administrated their administrators? If the Duke hadn't been distracted, like all superior minds, he would have noticed that it was his system, that of the inequality of intelligence, that was subversive of the social order. If authority depends on intellectual superiority, what will happen on the day when an administrated person, himself also convinced of the inequality of intelligence, thinks his prefect is an imbecile? Won't it be necessary to test ministers and prefects, burgermeisters and office heads, to verify their superiority? And how will we be sure that some imbecile, whose shortcomings when recognized would lead to citizens' disobedience, might not slip in among them? Only the partisans of the equality of intelligence can understand this. If the Cadi makes his slaves obey him, the white man his blacks, it is because he is neither superior nor inferior to them in intelligence. If circumstances and conventions separate and make hierarchies among men, if they create authority and force obedience, it is because they alone are capable of doing that. It's precisely because we are all equal by nature that we must all be unequal by circumstances. 16. Equality remains the only reason for inequality. Society exists only through distinctions, and nature presents only equalities. It is in fact impossible for equality to last for a long time, but even when it is destroyed, it remains the only reasonable explanation for conventional distinctions. 17. The equality of intelligence does even more for inequality. It proves that the overturning of the existing order would be just as irrational as the order itself. If someone asks me, what do you think of the organization of human societies? I would respond, this spectacle seems against nature. Nothing is in its place, since there are different places for beings that aren't different. Page 89. And if human reason is called on to change the order, it would have to recognize its incapacity to do so. Order for order, places for places, differences for differences, there are no reasonable motives for change. 18. The philosopher king and the sovereign people. Thus equality alone remains capable of explaining an inequality that the inegalitarians will always be powerless to imagine. Reasonable man knows the reason for his irrationality as a citizen. But he knows it at the same time to be insurmountable. He is alone in knowing the circle of inequality. But as a citizen, he himself is enclosed in it. There is only one raison, yet it hasn't organized the social order. So, happiness could not lie therein. 19. Philosophers are undoubtedly right to denounce the functionaries who try to rationalize the existing order. That order has no reason. But they deceive themselves by pursuing the idea of a social order that would finally be rational. The two extreme and symmetrical poles of that pretension are known, the old Platonic dream of the philosopher king and the modern dream of the people's sovereignty. Undoubtedly a king can be a philosopher just like any other man. As the head, a king has at his disposal his ministers' reason, who have their bureau heads' reason, who in turn have everybody's reason. It's true that he is not dependent on his superiors, only on his inferiors. But the philosopher king or the kingly philosopher takes part in society, and society imposes its laws, its superiorities, and its explanatory corporations on him, as it does on everyone. This is also why the other pole of the philosophical dream, the people's sovereignty, is no sounder. For that sovereignty, presented as an ideal to be realized or a principle to be imposed, has always existed. And history resounds with the names of those kings who lost their throne for having ignored it. Not one of them reigns except by the weight given him by the masses. The philosophers are indignant. The people, they say, cannot part with its sovereignty. 90. We will answer that perhaps it can't, but that it has always done so since the beginning of the world. Kings don't make peoples, they would try in vain to do so. But peoples can make leaders, and they have always wanted to do so. 20. The people is alienated from its leader exactly like the leader from his people. This reciprocal subjugation is the very principle of the political fiction whose origin lies in the alienation of reason by the passion of inequality. The philosopher's paralogism is to assume a people of men. But this is a contradictory expression, an impossible being. There are only peoples of citizens, people who have given up their reason to the inegalitarian fiction. Let's not confuse this alienation with another. We aren't saying that the citizen is the ideal man, the inhabitant of an egalitarian political heaven that masks the reality of the inequality between concrete individuals. We are saying the opposite, that there is no equality except between men, that is to say, between individuals who regard each other only as reasonable beings. The citizen, on the contrary, the inhabitant of the political fiction, is man fallen into the land of inequality. Reasonable man knows, therefore, that there is no political science, no politics of truth. Truth settles no conflict in the public place. It speaks to man only in the solitude of his conscience. It withdraws the moment that conflict erupts between two consciences. Whoever hopes to meet up with it must know, in any case, that it travels alone, without any retinue. Political opinions, on the other hand, never fail to give themselves the most imposing retinue, brotherhood or death, they say, or, when their turns come, legitimacy or death, oligarchy or death, etc. The first term varies but the second is always expressed or understood on the flags, the banners of all opinions. On the right, we read the sovereignty of A or death. On the left it's the sovereignty of B or death. Death is never missing. I even know philosophers who say, suppression of the death penalty or death. 21. As for truth, it isn't given any sanction, it doesn't associate with death. Following Pascal, let's say, page 91. We have always already found a means of giving justice to force, but we aren't close to finding the way to give force to justice. The very project doesn't make sense. A force is a force. It can be reasonable to make use of it, but it is irrational to want to render it reasonable. How to rave reasonably? So it remains to the reasonable man to submit to the madness of being a citizen, while trying to safeguard his reason. Philosophers believe they have found the way, no passive obedience, they say, no duties without rights. But this is speaking from distraction. There is nothing, there will never be anything, in the idea of duty that implies rights. Whoever is alienated is absolutely alienated. To suppose anything else is a poor ruse of vanity that has no other effect than to rationalize alienation and to trick the one who pretends otherwise. Reasonable man will not be taken in by these tricks. He will know that the social order has nothing better to offer him than the superiority of order over disorder. Any sort of order, so long as it cannot be troubled, that has characterized social organization since the beginning of the world. 22. Keeping a monopoly on legitimate violence is still the proven best way to limit violence and allow reason some asylum where it can be freely practiced. Reasonable man thus does not consider himself above the law. Were he to attribute this superiority to himself, he would plummet into the destiny of those inferior superiors who constitute the human species and maintain its irrationality. He will consider the social order a mystery situated beyond reason's power, the work of a superior reason that requires the partial sacrifice of his own. He will submit himself as citizen to that which the irrationality of governments requires, refusing only to adopt the reasons given by it. He will not, for all that, abdicate his reason. He will bring it back to its first principle. Reasonable will, we have seen, is first of all the art of conquering oneself. Reason will preserve itself faithfully by controlling its own sacrifice. Page 92. Reasonable man will be virtuous. He will partially give away his reason at the command of irrationality, in order to maintain the threshold of rationality that is the capacity to conquer oneself. Thus reason will always maintain an impenetrable stronghold in the middle of irrationality. Social irrationality is war in its two aspects, the battlefield and the tribunal. The battlefield is the true portrait of society, the consequence produced exactly and integrally by the opinion on which it is founded. When two men meet each other, they are polite as though they believed each other equal in intelligence, but if one of them is found deep in the middle of the other's country, there is no longer as much ceremony, he abuses his force like his reason, everything about the intruder denotes a barbarian origin, he is treated without ceremony like an idiot. His pronunciation causes peals of laughter, the awkwardness of his gestures, everything about him, announces the bastard species to which he belongs. They are a heavy people, we are light and frivolous, they are coarse, we are proud and high-minded. In general, one people believes itself in good faith to be superior to another people, and when a little passion is thrown in, war erupts, as many people as possible are killed, on both sides, like insects being crushed. The more killed, the more glory. One is paid so much per head, a cross is demanded for a burned village, a great ribbon if it's a big city, and this traffic in blood is called love of country. It is in the name of country that you attack neighboring peoples like savage beasts, and if you were asked what your country is, you would all cut each other's throats before agreeing on the matter. Point 23. And yet, says a chorus of philosophers and the common conscience, we must make distinctions. There are unjust wars, wars of conquest that the madness of domination demands, and there are just wars, those where we defend the ground of our country under attack. The former artilleryman Joseph Jacato must have known this, he who had defended his endangered country in 1792 and who, in 1815, opposed with all his parliamentarian strength the king's return in the hands of the invaders. Page 93. But it was precisely his experience that allowed him to notice that the morality of the thing was completely different from what it had seemed at first. The defender of the country under attack does as a citizen what he would not do as a man. He doesn't have to sacrifice his reason to virtue. For reason requires the reasonable animal to do what he can to preserve himself as a living being. Reason, in this case, is reconciled with war, and egoism with virtue. There is thus no particular merit in all this. On the other hand, he who obeys the orders of the conquering country, if he is reasonable, meritoriously sacrifices his reason to society's mystery. He needs far more virtue to preserve his interior fortress and to know, when duty is done, how to return to nature, to reconvert into the virtue of free thought the self-mastery he invested in being obedient as a citizen. But for all this, war between armies is still reason's least difficult test. Reason is content to control its own suspension. It suffices for it to dominate itself as it obeys the voice of an authority that has enough power to make itself unequivocally heard by everyone. Much more perilous is action in those places where authority is yet to be established in the midst of contradictory passions, in assemblies deliberating law, in tribunals judging how it is to be applied. These places present reason with the same sort of mystery to which one can only bow down. In the middle of passion's brouhaha and irrationality's sophistries, the balance tips, law makes its voice heard, a voice that must be obeyed like that of a general. But this mystery requires the reasonable man's participation. It invites reason not onto the terrain of sacrifice but onto terrain that it assures it is its own, that of reasoning. And yet the reasonable man knows it is only a matter of combat, only the laws of war prevail. Success depends on the fighter's address and force, not his reason. This is why Pausion reigns here through its weapon, rhetoric. Rhetoric, we know, has nothing to do with reason. But is the opposite true? Doesn't reason have anything to do with rhetoric? Isn't it, in general, the speaking being's control of himself that permits him to make, in any domain, an artistic work? Reason would not be itself if it didn't grant the power to speak in the assembly as in any other place. Page 94. Reason is the power to learn all languages. It will thus learn the language of the assembly and the tribunal. It will learn to rave. So we must first side with Aristotle and against Plato. It is shameful for the reasonable man to get beaten in a tribunal, shameful for Socrates to have lost the battle and his life to Meletus and Anytus. The language of Anytus and Meletus, the orator's language, must be learned. And it is learned like other languages, more easily, even, than the others, for its vocabulary and syntax are enclosed in a tight circle. The everything is in everything slogan applies better here than in any other study. Thus something must be learned, a speech by Mirabeau, for example, and the rest will follow. This rhetoric that required so much work for the students of the old master is a game for us. We know everything in advance, everything is in our books, only the names must be changed. 24 But we also know that the bombast of sentences and stylistic ornament are not the quintessence of oratorical art. Their function is not to persuade minds but to distract them. What carries the decree just as against a fortification is assault, words, the decisive gesture. An assembly's fate is often decided by the audacious person who, to stifle discussion, is the first to cry out voice vote. So let us also learn, we too, the art of crying out voice vote, at the right moment. Let us not say this isn't worthy of us and of reason. Reason doesn't need us, it's we who need it. Our so-called dignity is only laziness and cowardice, similar to that of the proud child who doesn't want to improvise in front of his peers. In a little while, perhaps, we will also cry out voice vote. But we will shout it out along with the band of cowards who are echoing the winning orator, he who will have dared what we were too lazy to do. Is it, then, a matter of making universal teaching into a school of political cynicism, reviving the sophistries Bentham denounced? Whoever wants to understand this lesson of the irreasonable man raving must rather compare it with that of the ignorant schoolmaster. Page 95. It is a question of verifying, in all cases, Ariason's power, of always seeing what can be done with it, what it can do to remain active in the very heart of extreme irrationality. The reasonable man raving, enclosed in the circle of social madness, shows that the individual's reason never ceases to exercise its power. In the closed field of the passions exercises of the distracted will, it must be shown that attentive will can always do as much and more than what the passions can do. The queen of the passions can do better than they who are her slaves. The most seductive sophistry, the one with the most verisimilitude, will always be the work of the person who knows best what a sophistry is. He who knows the right way departs from it when necessary, as much as is necessary, and never too much. No matter what superiority passion grants us, it can itself be dazzled, since it is a passion. Reason sees everything as it is, it shows, it hides, as much as it deems suitable, never more, nor less. 25 This is a lesson not in ruse but in constancy. He who knows how to remain true to himself in the middle of irrationality will triumph over the passions of others exactly as he triumphs over his own. Everything is done by the passions, I know, but everything, even follies, would be much better done by reason. This is the unique principle of universal teaching. 26 Are we then that far from Socrates? He too taught, in the Phaedrus as in the Republic, that the philosopher will tell the good lie, the one that is exactly necessary and sufficient, because he alone knows what lying is. The whole difference for us is precisely in this: we suppose that everyone knows what lying is. It is even by this that we define the reasonable being, by his incapacity to lie to himself. We are thus not speaking at all about the wise man's privilege, but about the power of reasonable people. And this power depends on an opinion, that of the equality of intelligence. This is the opinion that was missing in Socrates, and that Aristotle couldn't correct. The very superiority that allows the philosopher to locate the tiny difference that fools every time dissuades him from speaking to the companions of slavery. 27 Page 96. Socrates did not want to make a speech to please the people, to seduce the ungainly animal. He didn't want to study the art of the sycophants Anytus and Meletus. He thought, and practically everyone praised him for it, that this would decay his own philosophy. But the basis for his opinion is this: Anytus and Meletus are imbecilic sycophants, Thus, there is no art in their speeches, only recipes, there is nothing to be learned from them. Yet the speeches of Anytus and Meletus were a manifestation of the human intelligence like those of Socrates. We won't say they were as good. We will say that they derived from the same intelligence. Socrates, the ignorant one, thought himself superior to the tribunal orators, he was too lazy to learn their art, he consented to the world's irrationality. Why did he act like this? For the same reason that defeat Laius, Oedipus, and all the tragic heroes, he believed in the Delphic oracle, he thought that he was the elect of the divinity, that she had sent him a personal message. He shared the madness of superior beings, the belief in genius. A divinely inspired being doesn't learn Anytus's speeches, doesn't repeat them, doesn't try, when he needs to appropriate their art. It is thus that the Anytuses become masters in the social order. But, one may still ask, wouldn't they be anyway? What good is triumphing in the forum if one already knows that nothing can change the social order? What good is it for reasonable individuals or the emancipated, if you will to save their lives and safeguard their reason, if they can do nothing to change society and are reduced to the sad advantage of raving better than the madman? The speech on the Aventine. Let's reply first of all that the worst is never certain, since, in a given social order, it's possible for all individuals to be reasonable. Society as such will never be reasonable, but it could experience the miracle of reasonable moments arising not in the coincidence of intelligences that would be stultification but in the reciprocal recognition of reasonable wills. Page 97. When the Senate raved, we joined Appius Claudius's chorus. That was the way to get it over with most quickly, to get to the scene on the Aventine sooner. It's Menenius Agrippa who is speaking now. And the details of what he is telling the plebeians matter little. The essential is that he is speaking to them, and they are listening to him, that they are speaking to him and he hears them. He speaks to them about legs and arms and stomachs, and that's perhaps not very flattering. But what he imparts to them is their equality as speaking beings, their capacity to understand as soon as they recognize themselves as equally marked by the sign of intelligence. He tells them they are the stomachs. This derives from the art learned by studying and repeating, by breaking apart and putting back together others' speeches, let's say, anachronistically, that it derives from intellectual emancipation. But he speaks to them as men, and, in so doing, makes them into men. This derives from intellectual emancipation. At the moment when society threatens to be shattered by its own madness, reason performs a saving social action by exerting the totality of its own power, that of the recognized equality of intellectual beings. For this moment of civil war undone, this moment of the reconquered, victorious power of reason, it was worth having saved his reason for so long, and apparently so futilely, by learning from Appius Claudius the art of raving better than he. There is a life to reason that can remain faithful to itself within social irrationality, and it can have an effect. This is what we must work toward. Whoever knows how, for the good of the cause, to compose, with equal attention, the diatribes of an Appius Claudius or the fables of a Menenius Agrippa is a student of universal teaching. Whoever recognizes, along with Menenius Agrippa, that every man is born to understand what any other man has to say to him knows intellectual emancipation. These happy encounters amount to little, say the impatient or the self-satisfied. And the Aventine is old history. But precisely at the same time, other voices, very different voices, make themselves heard, to affirm that the Aventine is the beginning of our history, page 98. That of the self-knowledge that makes yesterday's plebeians and today's proletarians capable of doing anything a man can do. In Paris, another eccentric dreamer, Pierre-Simon Ballanque, tells the story of the Aventine in his own way, and reads in it the same law proclaimed, that of the equality of speaking beings, of the power acquired by those who recognize themselves marked with the sign of intelligence and thus become capable of marking a name in heaven. And he announces this strange prophecy, Roman history, as it has appeared to us up till now, after having in part ordered our destiny, after having entered, in one form, into the composition of our social life, our customs, our opinions, our laws, comes now, in a different form, to order our new thoughts, those that must enter into the composition of our future social life. 28 In the workshops of Paris or Lyon, a few dreaming minds hear the story and recount it in their turn and in their manner. Undoubtedly this prophecy of a new era is a daydream. But this is not a daydream. One can always, at the very heart of inegalitarian madness, verify the equality of intelligence, and that verification has an effect. The victory on the Aventine is very real. And undoubtedly it isn't where we think it is. The tribunes, the plebeians, one would rave just like the others. But that every plebeian felt himself a man, believed himself capably, believed his son and any other person capable, of exercising the prerogatives of intelligence, this is not nothing. There cannot be a class of the emancipated, an assembly or a society of the emancipated. But any individual can always, at any moment, be emancipated and emancipate someone else, announce to others the practice and add to the number of people who know themselves as such and who no longer play the comedy of the inferior superiors. A society, a people, a state, will always be irrational. But one can multiply within these bodies the number of people who, as individuals, will make use of reason, and who, as citizens, will know how to seek the art of raving as unreasonably as possible. Page 99. It can thus be said, and it must be said, if each family did what I am saying, the nation would soon be emancipated, not with the emancipation given by scholars, by their explications at the level of the people's intelligence, but with the emancipation seized, even against the scholars, when one teaches oneself. 29.